In some of my past projects, you may have seen me mill tenons using a circular saw, and that way works pretty well, but there is a better way. I'm going to use a piece of MDF and some oak to make a captive saw table that I can use to help end mill pieces of lumber in the future. I'll start off by attaching one of the fences on one side with a little bit of glue and some nails. The second fence needs to be set just the width of the base of your saw. Now, it's got to be tight enough to keep the saw from wiggling around, but it's also got to be loose enough so that the saw doesn't jam up in it. Once I'm satisfied that the saw is going to slide freely in that slot, I can mark out the position and glue it and nail it in place. Now I just need to let the glue set up. Now while I'm waiting for the glue to dry up, I've done one more task. I've taken a little end stop here and glued it in place at the back of the saw. Now I need to make a plunge cut into the board below for the saw blade. So I've raised my saw all the way up, and then I'm going to plunge cut right into this board. I want to note where the center of the saw blade is, and it's right here. That's going to be the deepest point for my saw and where I'm going to want to start any action that's happening underneath. Now I made this saw table a lot longer than I needed to, and that's because it was easier than making it shorter and trying to make it longer. But I know for this type of work, I can't imagine I'll ever be using more than, say, 6-inch wide tenons. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and push this forward 6 more inches. I've moved the saw arbor from this point to this point, 6 inches. And I need to mark where the end stop is going to go now, which will be up here. So this will be installed here. Now, I guess I should let this set up for a while before I mess with it any further. I'm sure after you saw me make that table, you look at it and go, well, but why? Well, the reason why is not the table itself, it's the fence that's going to have to go underneath. So I'm going to go ahead and make that while the glue sets up over there. I'm going to start off by cutting a 4-inch wide strip of MDF that I'll use as the fence base. Why 4 inches? Because it feels right. This fence is great and all, although I suppose it won't keep the cows out, but in order to use it, and if I attach it directly to the bottom of that captive saw table, it won't be adjustable at all. So I need to make another piece to back this up so that I can attach it to the table and adjust it as necessary. Now, based on the dimensions of the table, I've worked out that that piece needs to be 7 inches wide. These parts of the fence should go together just fine, but I want to make sure they're nice and strong and put some gussets along the angle. Now maybe it looks like I'm going to cut an awful lot of gussets here, but I've actually cheated. This isn't going to be just one fence. I'm going to make 2 out of this. Anyway, let me go ahead and cut this. It's 3 1/4 inches wide. These gussets are simple enough to cut. I'm just going to do them with a speed square. But it is important to do them in the right order, or else you're going to be working with really tiny pieces of wood, and that puts your fingers in jeopardy. There we go. 4 little gussets. Let's go ahead, pre-drill, screw, and glue these together. I've gone ahead and laid out the positions for the gussets and marked out where the screws are going to be. There's a few things that are important here. One, make sure that you leave enough space in between the gusset and the edge to put on clamps. I left about 1 inch there. It's very tempting to install these like that, but you'll have trouble later on. Second, while I try very hard to make things without critical dimensions, in this case it's an exception. This fence needs to be a right angle. If it's not going to work properly later on. Once this thing is glued up, I'm going to cut it so that I have one short 6-inch fence, and well, I guess the other part will be 18 inches long. I'm going to go ahead, pre-drill the holes, and assemble this. Once all the holes are laid out and pre-drilled properly, go ahead, put a thin layer of glue on the wide base plate, spread it out. By the way, if you're working with fine wood, don't spread glue with your fingers. You're almost certain to get it elsewhere on your project. I'm just being a little sloppy here. I'm just using some 1 5/8 drywall screws here to put it together. You want to do this work carefully, because this is probably the most critical part of the assembly. If you get this messed up, you get to start over. Once you got 1 or 2 screws in place, use a good square. Make sure everything is being assembled properly. And it looks like it's doing fine. Continue to check that during the assembly. Once I put these screws in, I'll go ahead and screw those gussets in place. Now that the glue is set up a bit, I'm just going to cut these into the 2 separate parts using my speed square. When we first laid out the table, I showed you how to mark the maximum depth of cut location using the saw arbor at maximum penetration. Now you'll see why that becomes important. I've marked that line across the top and around to the back. This is going to be the location where we're going to want to install this fence here. Now this isn't complicated. We do want to make sure it's square. We'll just screw it in place, and then I'm going to trim off this tab at the end. Now, a fixed end stop is just fine, because the maximum depth of cut is the maximum depth of cut. But on the other hand, the other fence needs to be adjustable. So I'll be cutting some slotted holes for carriage bolts to hold this in place. In order to correctly locate those bolts, I've flipped the table back so that it's right side up. Now, to hold them in, I'm using 3/8 inch carriage bolts, and I want to make sure that they're outside the working area for the saw, and I also want to make sure they clear the fence here. So if I look at this, I need, let's call it a 5/8 inch clearance between this and the wall. Next, we need to flip it back over again. Make sure that our bolt holes don't interfere with either of our gussets here. So about here and about here look right. I'll go ahead and finish out the markings and drill the holes. Because MDF breaks out pretty easily, I'm going to drill a little pilot hole first, and then change out to a 3/8 inch bit and drill from both sides. So I'll just start it on one side here, flip it over, and drill the rest of the way through from the other side. Now when we push our 3/8 inch carriage bolt in there, you'll see it's going to sit proud because of the square part at the top. I'm going to get a chisel, square the top of that hole out a little bit. For the adjustable fence, we're going to need to cut slots for those carriage bolts so that it's adjustable. We'll start off by drilling some pilot holes. I'll be drilling out this slot with a 1/2-inch Forstner bit to give it a little bit of play so that I can adjust things freely when I'm trying to set it up. Now, some would say this might be easier done with a router bit, and that's probably true, except for it involve a lot of setup, and I want to keep the number of tools here to a minimum. Once I've drilled halfway through on one side, I'm going to flip it over and finish out the drilling from the other side. Clean up the holes with a chisel. Once the slots have been milled up and cleaned, it's ready to be assembled for use. 2 washers. Wing nuts are a little bit easier to use than bolts. I'll have to set up a demo to show you how it works, but for now, my saw kerf is here. This slides in and out smoothly and can be screwed down in position. Now, as is, this will work with a pair of C-clamps, but I want to add in one more feature. I'm going to make a clamp to hold the workpiece to this fence. I went digging in my loose hardware box and came up with these massive 1/2-inch bolts that I used for my rammed earth project. Now, if I'm going to use these, I'd better reinforce this thing a bit so that I don't tear it apart when I screw it together. So to start with, I'm going to add a block behind the fence to strengthen it up. And second, I'm going to need to cut a block to put in here behind the other fence to keep it from crushing as well. Mark the locations for the clamp bolts carefully so that you don't hit any screws that are already inside the fence. Drill the final hole with a 5/8" bit to make sure that the clamps pass freely. With the clamping through bolts in place, go ahead and mark out and drill the corresponding holes in your clamping board. Because of the width of this fence here, the clamp isn't going to be able to clamp down on 3/4 inch or other smaller material. Make a spacer block, glue it and screw it in place here so that you can clamp smaller size wood. I think this is about done. Let's go ahead, set it up with a piece of scrap wood and try it out. Well, that sure beats the way I was doing it before. So with just a few minor adjustments, you can cut the entire tenon quite accurately with a circular saw jig, both safely and quickly. Now, I can imagine you might be thinking, that was a lot of work to make one simple cut. Well, First of all, it makes the cut much more accurately and safely than the way I was doing it before. But perhaps more importantly, much of this is reusable. Once this fence is taken off, it can be reused as a router table fence or as a crosscut sled on your table saw. Maybe I'll show you how to make those next. This is a great little jig. It only takes about an afternoon to build. It costs maybe $15 in materials, and it's safe, it's fast, and it cuts tenons more accurately than any other method that I know. If you've enjoyed these videos, please leave a comment and let me know. I'll try to make some plans available sometime online, and we'll see how that goes. Thanks for watching.